The discussion about race has moved from Charlottesville to Charleston. In this edition of Quintin's Close-Ups, I sit down one-on-one with professor and historian Damon Fordham. And be sure to download the free Quintin's Close-Ups app in your Apple or Google Play stores. Well, Damon, it is so good to see you.
Thank you. Same here.
Likewise.
As always. As
Yes,
always.
sir. Well, as you know, right now there's a joint news conference going on with the with the South Carolina Secessionist Party and Black Nationalist Movement.
What?
Yeah.
They're meeting together as we speak?
Yeah, joint news conference, yes, sir.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's happening outside the Charleston City Hall at broad meeting, as you know.
No, I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, right there at City Hall. And the two group leaders shook hands and said that they hope to work together to stop violence.
Really?
Yes, sir.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and I was wondering, what other questions do you have for them?
Wow. The secessionists actually met with black nationalists.
Yes, sir. According to news outlets, yes, sir.
According to news outlets. Well, I really don't have any questions for either of them, really, to be honest with you. I mean, I would like to, have more first-hand information about that before I make any kind of comment whatsoever. But if that's true, I don't see that as a bad thing if both sides are sincere about actually getting together to, solve various issues regarding violence and so forth.
Okay.
Because first of all, I'd have to know which individuals are involved. If I know them, I could perhaps make some comments about once I talk to them about it.
Sure.
But as a rule, my policy is not to speak on what I don't know.
Sure.
So I wasn't aware of that.
Sure.
So therefore, it would be irresponsible for me to comment on that.
Let me take you to the debate right now.
Okay.
Obviously, since the tragedy in Charlottesville, a lot of prominent people here in Charleston are actually asking for the government and really the state government to take down some monuments here in Charleston. Where are you with that debate?
Okay, as a historian and as a tour guide, I use that type of thing as a teachable moment to explain to people what the Confederacy is really all about.
Okay.
Now, to those who are trying to take it down, I just have a few things to say about that, and that is as follows. Before you get into that, know what you're talking about. By that I mean study these individuals who you were talking about, so if people ask you, why do you want them taken down, you can give a precise answer and not hearsay. Okay, do your research and do your homework before you go ahead with this. Secondly, they also have to be aware of the fact that there is this thing called the Heritage Act in South Carolina that was passed in 2000 when they were taking down the Confederate flag, which means 2/3 of the Senate and 2/3 of the House has to agree before they take down any monuments dealing with the Confederacy or the Civil Rights Movement. So be aware of that too. So with all of that, I say that if you're going to go ahead and do it, do your research and then examine yourselves as to why you want it done, and when this is going to have a constructive effect on the problems facing our communities, and that if people ask you why you want to do this, you can tell them precisely what it is about these individuals that you find repugnant, being specific with citations and so forth, showing that you've done your research so that no one can trip you up in debate, and that you're aware of the fact that you have to get 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate in this state of South Carolina before they even agree to that. Then, if you want to do that, that's fine. Because see, Nelson Mandela, in his book Long Walk to Freedom, once said that no leader promises people things that they have no plan, that they are unsure of planning how to get done.
Okay.
And see, that's part of the wisdom of studying the great leaders of the past, because they provide lessons for us in the present so we can avoid making mistakes in the future.
Powerful. Okay, I want to take you to Charlottesville because obviously that was, obviously it's still debate going on with that.
Mm-hmm.
I have a simplistic question for you.
Let's hear it.
How did we get here?
To what happened in Charlottesville?
Yes, sir.
Well, one could argue that problem started ever since, it's kind of a poetic irony that it was in Virginia that took place.
Okay.
Because the foundation of the racial problem in America, at least between the blacks and whites, You know, the Native Americans, and the others, that's another story.
Okay.
But the foundation of the problem between blacks and whites in these United States started on August 20th, 1619, when a Dutch ship called a man of war came into Jamestown with the first 20 Africans brought here to work as slaves, okay? So at the same time that was happening, you had the white indentured service coming here. The colonial government of Virginia was terrified of the idea that these white indentured servants and these enslaved blacks were getting a little too chummy because if the two of them came together, that would overthrow their power structure. And that almost happened in 1676 with Nathaniel Bacon, one of the indentured servants, with Bacon's Rebellion. But he died of dysentery before that could go through. So when Nathaniel Bacon died, the colonial government of Virginia went, whew, boy, we dodged a bullet that time. And to prevent that from happening in the future, they began to phase out white indentured servitude and increase black slavery. And they encouraged the poor whites to disassociate themselves from the blacks as an inferior caste. So in other words, it was dividing and conquering of the poor so that the rich could stay rich. Now, this is what Martin Luther King had to say about that subject.
Okay.
It may be said of the slavery era that the white man took the world and gave the Negro Jesus. Then it may be said of the Reconstruction era that the Southern aristocracy took the world and gave the poor white man Jim Crow. He gave him Jim Crow, and when his wrinkled stomach cried out for the food that his empty pockets could not provide, he ate Jim Crow, a psychological bird that told him that no matter how bad off he was, at least he was a white man better than the black man. And he ate Jim Crow. And when his undernourished children cried out for the necessities that his low wages could not provide, he showed them the Jim Crow signs on the buses and the stores and on the streets and the public buildings, and his children too learned to feed upon Jim Crow, their last outpost of psychological oblivion. Dr. King said that at the end of the march from Selma to Montgomery for voting rights on March the 25th, 1965, and that can be found in the book A Trumpet of Conscience, okay? Right. So what you have, so that situation, the dividing and conquering of the poor whites and the blacks is the foundation of racism in this country, and they use the poor whites as pawns. Right down the street from here, you had the Secession Hall, right, over on Meeting Street, which was destroyed by the Great Fire of 1861. Now, that was where they decided to secede from the Union. Why? Every single document admits that it was because of Abraham Lincoln's election to the presidency, which the white Southern aristocracy felt was the death knell of slavery. Okay, that's why they seceded. The secession documents all state that. Now, Robert Barnwell Rhett, one of the secessionists, was quoted as saying this. When he was asked, what did the common people, that is, the poor white majority who were too poor to own slaves, what did they have to gain by seceding from the Union and all that? Robert Barnwell Rhett said this: whoever waited for the common people when a great movement was to be made, we must make the move and force them to follow. That is the way of all revolutions and all great achievements. That is from Alan Weinstein and Frank Otto Gattel's book, American Negro Slavery, A Modern Reader.
Wow.
Now, how does all this fall into what happened in Charlottesville, Virginia? Right. That means that the marginalized white class in this country has a history of being brainwashed by their so-called leaders into supporting causes that were against their own best interests, for the simple fact that a lot of them would thus psychologically have a group below them. Now, let's take this to President Trump, for example. Now, President Trump did not create this. I get that. He is not solely responsible for that. It has been on long before he came along. And there were people who supported President Trump who did not necessarily support this type of view. Okay. They were, I believe that some of them were good people who were deceived into supporting a man that was not good for the country, but right now they're too proud to admit that they picked the wrong man to run this country. But the fact of the matter was, the David Dukes and the Steve Bonners and the alt-right and all these type of characters, these people were marching down the street chanting "Heil Trump," as you can see in every newscast of that event, okay? And it took him 2 days to disavow all of this, all right? So even Lindsey Graham, the Republican senator of South Carolina, said that these people find a friend in Donald Trump who support this alt-right stuff. But what does President Trump think of them? Listen to this. This is President Trump speaking in, June the 22nd, 2017. Quote, somebody said, "Why did you appoint a rich person to be in charge of the economy?" I said, "Because that's the kind of thinking we want. They're representing the country. They don't want the money. They're representing the country. They had to give up a lot to take these jobs. They give up a lot. I love all people, rich and poor, but in these particular persons, I just don't want a poor person. Does that make sense? If you insist, I'll do it, but I like it better this way." He said that in Sioux City, Iowa, on June 22nd, 2017. And then there was that infamous statement that he made. The following statement was made in Sioux City, Iowa. Okay. I could stand in the middle of Saks Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody, and I wouldn't lose any voters. He said that on January 23rd, 2016. The earlier statement was made on June 22nd, 2017. Now, does that sound like a man who cares about the poor and the marginalized people of America? I would say not. So you have the pitiful sight of these marginalized people in Charlottesville, Virginia, marching in support of a Confederacy that did not have their best interests at heart, for a man today who does not have their best interests at heart. And to me, I think it is a tragedy, and why people need to understand critical thinking and not just respond emotionally to people who tell them what they want to hear, but study what they're getting into and look before they leap.
Let me take you to Catherine Templeton. She obviously made some controversy over her comments about the Confederacy. Mm-hmm. And she took to Twitter to say this, quote, "I recently come under attack from the press and others for my comments about the Confederate flag. If it's politically incorrect to say I'm a proud daughter of the Confederacy, then call me politically incorrect. My father was named after Judge William Bartley, a Confederate soldier who fought under General Robert E. Lee and lost his arm at the Battle of Seven Pines. I have a son named Hampton and a dog named Dixie, but that doesn't make me a racist. It makes me from South Carolina and proud of it. It's outrageous to me that some would have me disavow my family and our history." What do you take away from that?
Well, if we're talking about history, I think she needs to study that history. Because on March the 21st, 1861 in Savannah, Georgia, Alexander Stephens, the Vice President of the Confederacy, said that the cornerstone of our new government is the eternal truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man and slavery is his natural condition. This same Robert E. Lee, in a letter to his son in 1868, and this is from Robert E. Lee Jr.'s autobiography where he's talking about himself and his father, said that his father warned him in a letter not to hire Negro workers because these are the people who are plotting against us. He's referring to Reconstruction here, okay? And granted, Robert E. Lee freed his slaves in 1856, but the records, the written records in the book Slave Testimony by John W. Blassingame, his own former slaves are quoted as saying how brutal he was as a slave owner. Now, there are people out there who say that things like this are just stirring up old hatreds and all this sort of stuff. No, it's stirring up facts, because if you want to validate and look up to somebody, you need to know what you're validating and looking up to. The fact of the matter is this: the poor whites of the South were duped fighting for the rich whites of the South, because as a matter of fact, in this thing called the Confederacy, they weren't even united to begin with. If you look up any history book, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri were all slave states who refused to join the Confederacy because they realized how wasteful that was. 48 counties in Virginia refused to join the Confederacy, and they seceded to become the state of West Virginia. And you have people today from Virginia and West Virginia who don't know that that's the real reason why those are two states today. In Mississippi, you had a man by the name of Newton Knight who found out about this thing called the 20 Negro Law. What was that? That was a law that said that if you were a rich plantation owner that owned more than 20 slaves, you were exempt from the Confederacy, which meant that it was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. And so he led Jones County, Mississippi to secede from the Union and become the Free State of the Jones, which was the subject of a recent movie by the same name. So the thing about it was, people will say, well, my ancestors didn't own slaves and they fought for the Confederacy. Well, that's more than likely true because the slave owners were just a small percent of those who fought. But what were they fighting for? They were fighting for a cause that they had no dog in their fight. And after the Civil War, the ugly reality that they were in all of this poverty, had all this death and destruction, over wasting their lives over rich people who were owning slaves, was too bitter a pill to swallow, so they taught this myth for the last century about states' rights and tariffs and all that nonsense. And all that is a tragedy, and as commonly said by the great Harvard philosopher Jorge Santayana, those who don't remember the past are condemned to repeat it, and that's what we see going on right now. And that's why we need to study history so we don't make these mistakes again.
Damon Fordham, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate this.
You're very welcome. Thank you.